Have you ever stood in the jam or jelly aisle at your local grocery store and wondered, why do we need so many choices? Cherry, gooseberry, strawberry, grape, orange marmalade, quince. What the heck is a quince? Peach, blueberry, chokecherry, apricot, apple, blackberry, and the list goes on. Sometimes I just stand and stare, with a general feeling of haziness coming over my brain. And then once you've chosen a flavor, you have to decide which brand you want to buy it from, and if you want it in sugar-free or full sugar mode. I feel life would be easier to just have 2 or maybe 3 choices when it comes to choosing things: strawberry or grape, chocolate or vanilla, milk chocolate or dark chocolate. We don't need that white chocolate. Actually, science backs up this idea. In an article in Forbes magazine, Elena Rutskaya writes, "Alongside colleagues from other universities, I have been looking into uncovering how human brains work when having to make a choice among an array of different options. In our research, we found that although the human brain finds the concept of choice, or even an abundance of choice, attractive, too many options make it difficult for our brains to process, evaluate, and compare these choices. This phenomenon is called choice overload, and it explains why we often walk away from a well-stocked shop or supermarket empty-handed or very stressed, even if we've managed to finally choose something." Now, they used MRI scanners to study people's brain activity while they were choosing from different sized sets of groups. Participants had to choose from groups of either 6 items, or 12 items, or 24 items. And not surprisingly, studies find that more choice is better up to a certain point, after which choice becomes overwhelming and decision-making is impaired. A different study showed that as the brain took in more information, the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for strategic planning and decision-making, became more and more active. This is what we would expect, but here's where it gets interesting. At a certain point, as more and more information, like choices, was processed by the brain, the participants simply couldn't handle any more, and their prefrontal cortexes went dark. Like an overloaded circuit, the brain didn't just slow down, it simply shut off when presented with too much information. Information overload or choice overload is a real phenomenon in our brains. Well, our text today is about choice. And akin to standing in the jelly aisle, this one can also feel overwhelming. However, there's only 2 options. After 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, a journey which reportedly should have taken anywhere between 11 days to a month, 40 years, and after the death of Moses, Joshua was chosen to lead the Israelites into the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey, the land promised by God. And in today's text, it's time for this aging, faithful leader to offer his last words of instruction before he departs this life. So this is part of his farewell speech. The place where Joshua gathered together the people is Shechem, the place where long ago God had appeared to Abraham and promised the gift of descendants and land. And in turn, Abraham built an altar at that sacred space. Joshua chose this place as a backdrop because it showed God's faithfulness to his promises. Joshua begins to prepare the people for life without him by retelling the story of God's redemptive work in their past, reminding the people of God's redemptive work in their past. How the times that God had their backs, the times that God had showed up, the times that God was faithful to his promises. The question for the Israelites then was this: Will they see all that God has done throughout the history of their people, including in their own lives? And will this be the basis of their identity going forward? In other words, will they follow God or will they not? In his story, Joshua doesn't follow the typical lineage of the ancestors Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Instead, Joshua goes even further back in history to Terah, Abraham's father, and Nahor, Abraham's brother. Terah and Nahor served other gods. In including them in the faith lineage, Joshua shows that from the people's beginning, there have always been instances of faithlessness. From the beginning of Israel's history, Joshua is telling the people around him, there have been those who did not choose to serve the Lord, and they did not prosper. In contrast to this, Joshua stands before the people, and he says that he and his household have chosen to follow and serve Yahweh, God. He stated his decision and said that even if the people chose differently, he would not change his mind. And it's a good thing that Joshua's mind was made up, because he faces a vacillating, fickle multitude, easily swayed this way and that, one day singing the praises of God, and the next day dancing around the golden calf. It was a decisive moment as Joshua listed all the ways that God had led them to this place, the Promised Land. I don't know what you're going to do, he said, but as for me and my house, we are going to serve the Lord. Surrounded by a multitude of people, uncertain what they would do, Joshua took a stand. And it was a risky stand to take, because it's always risky taking a stand. We'd rather be liked. We'd rather be popular. But as a former CEO pointed out once, if you want to be liked, get a dog. As people of faith, we often have to make the unpopular decision, choosing love over hate, choosing forgiveness over resentment, choosing hope over despair. And we do it even if it's not the status quo, because we follow a God who gave us life over death. Joshua fully recognizes that there are other options available, other gods, other ways of life. A decision must be made, but he warns them that a decision to commit to God is not easy and cannot be made half-heartedly, because this God does not want a casual commitment, a part-time following. What this God requires is a commitment that will impact every dimension of the people's lives, every dimension. And this choice was not the easy choice. Sure, the Lord had done all kinds of good things for them. Yes, they were grateful, but life hadn't always been easy for the Israelites. There'd been plenty of tough times. After all, they'd just been wandering around lost in the wilderness for 40 years, for goodness sake. So here was a choice. In one corner, those other gods. And those other gods, the ones worshipped by neighboring countries, well, sure, they presented an attractive deal. Those other gods called to the people, lured them, promised them all kinds of good perks, good harvests, good weather, fertility, prosperity, all the comforts to make life a little bit easier. And all they had to do in return was make the right sacrifice and rituals at the right times, in the right places. And then they were free to go on about their lives without any consideration for anybody else. They were free to be as self-obsessed and blind to their neighbors' needs as they wanted to be. But in the other corner was the God of Israel. And this God, Yahweh, demanded more than just worship and ritual. This God demanded justice within the community, concern for the poor, the widow, and orphan, care for the stranger and those who were different from the Israelites, the sharing of resources. That was a tall order. This God demanded a lot. Those are your choices, Joshua says. Now choose right now who you will serve, and don't make your choice lightly. The Israelites may profess loyalty to God, but Joshua knows all too well that talk is cheap and obedience is costly, and that Yahweh is a demanding God, expecting allegiance from those who claim to follow him. So, no, it wasn't an easy choice. And if I'm honest with myself, I'm not sure which choice I would have made back then. But Joshua shows them how God has been faithful to them throughout history, and just like them, you and I need to look and see the many, many ways God has been present in not only our lives, but in the lives of those who have come before us. At the end of life, I have learned in my work, we are fortunate enough sometimes to have the opportunity to tell our story. We tell stories of our joys and our sorrows. We tell the stories of what we have done right and where we have missed the mark. We tell the stories of God's goodness in our lives. And if we can't tell that story, then we wrestle with what to feel, what is next, how to make peace with our mortality. The most meaningful deaths are those where the individual can look back and say, I have been blessed. God has been faithful. Life has been good. Joshua is inviting us to take this journey and see these things in our own lives, how God has been good, and to do it now, today, before we reach the end of our lives. Many of us were raised in the church, and it's just been a natural thing to continue to be involved in the religious life because it was handed off to us, passed on from a previous generation. We remember sitting in the hard wooden pews, fidgeting as a young child, wondering when the sermon would end. Some of you are wondering that right now. We remember Sunday school stories and activities, Christmas pageants, being confirmed, going to youth groups. Going to church is what we do today, minus the fidgeting, because it's what we've always done. Others came later in life to religion or church, and I wonder if maybe these individuals have a better sense of what it means to choose God, because they made the intentional choice to follow all on their own. It wasn't just something they'd always done. Whether God is new to us or a lifelong companion, we have to intentionally choose God. Every day, we have to choose. It's like a marriage. The marriage vows are not a one-time thing. They need to be said every day. Every day, the two people need to say, I choose you. And it's the same with God. It's a relationship, and we cannot passively journey with God. Saying to God, I choose you, might very well be the hardest option. In fact, I guarantee it is, because saying to God, I choose you, will mean putting our own wants and desires aside in consideration of other people, some who we know and others who are complete strangers to us, some who we love and adore and others who irritate us to no end. Saying to God, I choose you, means saying, I choose to work for justice, I choose to seek kindness, and I choose to try to walk humbly with you, O God. Now, the short-term benefits might seem less sparkly than what the world offers as alternatives, but the long-term benefits can't be beat. The fact of the matter is this: God has already chosen us. And you and I are called to choose how we will live out the joy of having been so chosen. Shall we live it in hope and love and promise by following God, or shall we not? We are never compelled to choose God. We are invited to. Serving God means serving and worshiping God alone and not other gods. Indeed, Joshua admonished the people to put away those other gods. Put away, set them aside, discard them, take them out with the trash. And what are the other gods in our lives? I don't think most of us worship other deities. The other gods you and I worship tend to be more material things. Material things, our possessions, our collections of stuff that we turn to and add to in the hopes that it will fill up the hole that we feel within us sometimes, the emptiness that is in our hearts that only God can fill. These things become our God. Or how about our independence, our self-sufficiency, which we're so proud of, but that blinds us to how we are tied together with the rest of humanity and have been commanded to take care of each other, especially the least of these. Independence and self-sufficiency can become our God. What other gods do we have in our lives? Because I think each one of us struggles to place all of our hopes in the Lord our God alone. It's part of being imperfectly human. There are going to be times that we place our hopes in things beside God. We too, like the Israelites, can be seduced and drawn in toward things that promise us shiny things, exciting things, success, health, wealth. These are things that compete for our attention and our loyalty to God, and anything that distracts us from fully serving and loving God has become another God in our lives. Bob Dylan famously said, "You're gonna have to serve somebody." Today, Joshua is reminding us that we will either serve the Lord our God or we will serve our own interests. Today, I encourage you to take the uphill, more difficult road and choose God. It's a decision that will impact every single dimension of our lives. But if we do it, we will have life and have it in abundance. Not a life free from pain and struggle, mind you, but rather a life where we are surrounded by and sustained by the grace of our Lord. So I encourage you this week to spend time seeing all the ways in which God has been active and present in your life stories and in the lives of your ancestors who have gone before you, and choose this day whom you will serve. Like I said, today is the beginning of our stewardship campaign. This stewardship season is about building a firmer faith foundation, a foundation from which every dimension of our lives is changed, a foundation from which we choose to live out our gratitude by giving. Stewardship, while about money, is also about so much more, and our focus is measuring what matters so that we can grow in our faith and become more faithful stewards of our resources, not just as individuals, but as a church community. During this stewardship season, we are inviting you into a more faith-filled way of living and into a relationship with a loving God who desires more for you, more than this world will ever give. So if you remember nothing else this morning, remember this: of all the things you can choose to follow in this world, choose God. Like I said earlier, while God has already chosen us, you and I are invited to choose how we will respond to that, how we will live out the joy of having been chosen. Shall we live it in gratitude and hope and love, or shall we not? We're not compelled to choose God, but we are invited to do so, and if we do it, it will be the making of a meaningful, fulfilling, joyful life. Thanks be to God that we are offered a better way to live. Thanks be to God that through his Son we are shown a way forward that leads to joy. Thanks be to God. Amen.